Live to Westminster, where we can talk to Eleanor Penny, senior editor at Novara Media, and Jonathan Isaby, editor of the website BrexitCentral. Hello to you both. Eleanor, he's not in a ditch. He's been in Cambridge campaigning. The election campaign is underway, even if Brexit isn't.
Yes, it's become an astonishing regularity of British politics these days that Boris Johnson is forced to tuck his tail between his legs, do a U-turn, and slink back into back to where he's come from. So this really shows us that the administration that is governing the country has very little plan for how to fix the many economic and social and socio-political problems that are facing us beyond putting arbitrary lines in the sand and desperately throwing everything to get any deal on the table, no matter what the impact is for ordinary citizens that they're supposed to be protecting. And Mark Francois has said, openly that the 31st deadline and how Boris has stuck to it, all guns blazing, up until today, has basically just been about saving the skin of the Tory party, which is in an existential crisis here, and not about, making anything better for anyone in this country, which is what they're supposed to be doing.
Eleanor, though, isn't that what this decision to have an election is all about? It's saying that Parliament is in stasis, that nothing is going to get through. There is a very pressing domestic agenda, and unless you have a new Parliament, you're not going to get anything done.
I think that's probably accurate, right? The fact that Boris Johnson has aligned himself in such a hardline way with the interests of the ERG in the hardest possible Brexit. We saw the consequences of that in the fact that his deal didn't actually even rule out no deal at the end of 2020 if trade negotiations were to fail. The fact that he's taken that tactical choice, which was very much about advancing his own career, means that he was unable to square the difference between the interests of the EU, the interests of Parliament, the interests of the DP, on whose votes he depended, and the interests of his kind of hardline backbench base. It's not surprising that we're in this status here. This is a crisis caused by the Conservative Party. And what we need now is, through this election, to have a genuine conversation to fill in those gaps that we haven't been able to do in the past 3 years, which is ask people, have conversations with people about what Brexit means to them. Because all of this kind of vagary, all of this Brexit means Brexit nonsense and dodging the question means that those gaps can be filled not by people, genuinely trying to take back control, as I'm sure many people do, but by the interests of, say, US pharmaceutical corporations who are trying to hike up UK prices on drugs nearly 2.5 times, so that ordinary people are left without the vital health support that they need. That's what the debate has devolved into. And I hope that throughout the course of this election, we can actually, honour the spirit of take back control and inject some democracy into this process finally.
Jonathan Isaby, how much of this is about the national interest or about self-interest?
It's certainly about the national interest, and it's about the interest of delivering on the democratic will of the British people from the referendum we had back in 2016. It's a huge regret that today we are not leaving the European Union. And the only reason we're not leaving the European Union today is because the Remainer-dominated Parliament conspired at every opportunity in recent weeks and indeed months to stop it from happening. They said that Boris Johnson would not get a deal with the European Union. He got a deal with the European Union, and yet they still conspired to stop it going through the House of Commons. Having told us for weeks or months that the only thing they were against was no deal. Well, as soon as the Prime Minister got a deal, they still worked to stop that from happening. So, frankly, I think the Prime Minister was left with no option but to call an election in order to get a new Parliament, because I'm afraid there are several hundred members of Parliament in the current House of Commons who have badly let down the people of this country, because the election we had in 2017, more than 80% of parliamentarians were returned on a platform of respecting the result of the referendum and delivering Brexit, and they have simply failed to do that, I'm afraid.
But ultimately, this is Boris Johnson's responsibility, isn't it? He made those promises do or die, rather be dead in a ditch, pick whichever one you want. He made a promise that he would deliver Brexit, and he hasn't. And that is going to be a key factor of this campaign, isn't it?
Look, I think it's perfectly clear for the public and your viewers to see the only reason that he could not deliver on that promise that he desperately wanted to keep was because Parliament stopped him. Parliament passed the Hillary Benn so-called Surrender Act in order to take no deal off the table, which massively undermined the government's negotiating position. I think it's been an outrage that
so
at many points during this process...
the deal he did eventually get was compromised as a result?
Oh, that's absolutely for sure, that he had to compromise in order to get that deal. But the fact is that Parliament, at every opportunity, it seems, over the last 3 years, has sought to undermine the government's national negotiating position and has made the job of both Theresa May and Boris Johnson so much harder in this process. And you've seen British parliamentarians going over to Brussels and encouraging Michel Barnier and other European figures to not even give us a deal and to give us the worst possible deal. I think people at this general election are going to look at those parliamentarians and hopefully make some judgments about whether they think they're suitable representatives to continue representing us in the House of Commons.
So, Eleanor, let's look to the campaign strategies of the various parties here. We've had Jeremy Corbyn launching his campaign, albeit unofficially today, with the line that it is the people versus the super rich, that Labour is on the side of the people. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives campaign is going to be very much about the people versus Parliament. Which is going to translate on the doorstep?
So let's dig into that people versus Parliament narrative, because the Boris Johnson administration has been very tub-thumping about pushing that line. But as the analysis we've just heard shows, that kind of analysis displays the political memory of a goldfish. Like, this was a few weeks ago. We remember that Boris Johnson brought a massive package of potential reforms that were set to transform the country, unrecognisably for many decades to come. And he demanded that first Parliament not really be allowed to scrutinise it, then it only be given a few days to scrutinise it. This is what we're talking about here. This is the contempt with which this government treats the bare-bone processes of British democracy, and people are getting fed up with it. Because honestly, I would hope, and I would think that the people versus the super rich message is going to cut through more, because this isn't just about Brexit. Many people care very deeply about Brexit, and rightly so. It's a big issue. But 71% of the British public also think that climate change is a much more pressing issue. And also people, while we play these parliamentary whispering parlour games, people are still starving on universal credit. People are still struggling to pay their rent. People are still facing a social care crisis. And these are things that are also at the front of people's minds, at the front of people's political agendas. And the Labour Party's manifesto, I think, has the capacity to speak more to those issues, to reach beyond the divide and find that common ground, particularly because they're taking a stance, put it back to the people stance. Now, that's not necessarily likely to please anyone who's very, very loyal to the idea of a no-deal Brexit or the hardest possible deal Brexit, but that's not the majority of the country, because the majority of the country are, still invested in a kind of livable planet and, economic security, which is very understandable, of course. And so, yes, Dominic Cummings is very keen on this people versus Parliament line. But in terms of actually being able to back that up with a real policy offer, we're already seeing the cracks, right? We're already seeing people like Matt Hancock going on the press circuit saying that he will fund the NHS, and people are going, hang on a second, haven't you just spent the last nearly decade defunding it even more than Margaret Thatcher did,
Okay, yeah. Let me bring Jonathan in, because I'm conscious we are short of time here. Jonathan, whatever happens on December the 12th, Parliament is going to look very different, isn't it? Because we've got this mass exodus of MPs who've said they're not going to stand again, predominantly because of the tone of debate, from the toxic atmosphere, from the level of abuse that MPs particularly female MPs, have been receiving. What does that tell us about the state of debate that we have at the moment?
Certainly, I get very upset by the way that sometimes these debates are had, and the abusive language and actions and threats from people on either side of this debate are obviously totally unacceptable. Absolutely, we should condemn anyone who tries to bully people, to be gratuitously offensive, but at the same time we need to have a robust and respectful debate. And I think it also needs to be said that there are millions of people out there in the country, millions of your viewers who voted for Brexit 3.5 years ago, who see a political class contriving to do everything they can at every opportunity, whether it be in Parliament or through the courts, in order to stop that democratic vote from being enacted. And that frustration is palpable. And I dare say some of that frustration will be on display over the coming weeks on the election campaign trail. And I think people do need to respectfully but robustly voice their views about that and make clear that that democratic vote absolutely has to be respected and indeed implemented. And when you look at what Jeremy Corbyn said today, he's refusing to even say how he'd vote in the referendum that he'd be holding in about 9 months' time on another European referendum. I think people find that utterly preposterous. You know, the referendum was 3.5 years ago. Both parties at the last election said they'd respect the result and deliver on Brexit. That absolutely now has to be done.
OK, Jonathan Isaby, Eleanor Penny, thank you both very much indeed.